Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome. This is week 11 of CS 747. So, as you remember, last week we introduced function approximation, something that we have to do because in practice we almost always end up with a very large number of states, sometimes even actions. And so, there is a need to generalize between states or actions. So, this week we continue in that same vein. This week's lecture takes in very practical considerations. So, the first topic today is tile coding. Okay, tile coding is a particular form of linear function approximation. We looked at linear function approximation last time, which is quite popular. Okay, it has many applications. It is sort of simple and elegant, easy to use. So I'll spend some time actually describing this particular form of function approximation, and then we will start looking at the dark side of things. So not all is well with function approximation and linear in reinforcement learning. So the particular ways in which we use it in practice, although they work quite often, they do have some technical issues. Okay, so we will look at those as a part of the lecture. That will be the second portion. And then we will look at a somewhat different class of methods called policy search. And I'll illustrate policy search with some examples from my own research, one having to do with soccer, humanoid robot soccer, and the other one to do with railway scheduling, okay, which is somewhat more recent work. But let's get started. Okay, let's take a look at tile coding. Okay, so here is the motivation for tile coding. Okay, so suppose, just for illustration, assume we are looking at the prediction task. We are trying to estimate V pi for some policy pi. And for simplicity, let's assume we are only looking at one feature. Maybe this is a task where there's only one feature, real valued feature X. Okay, and that's, I'm saying one because I can only draw one feature on the slide. You can imagine the same thing happening with many dimensions. But yeah, so V pi, let us say, as a function of this feature X, feature X is a feature X of state. It looks like this, okay? I just drew this by hand, so it's a particular value function, let us say. Looking at this, you might not be very convinced that it's a good candidate for linear function approximation, right? This doesn't look like a line, and we don't know how well we can approximate it by a line. But let's say we try. Okay, so we had one. Okay, I'm drawing a line saying that this is my best approximation of V pi. Okay, so yeah, we had one is going to be W times X, W1 times X plus W2, let us say for some W1 and W2. You get like a reasonable, at least visually, it looks like it's minimizing the squared error or something like that, right? In some sense, it's a best fit line. Is this the best we can do with linear function approximation? So that's the question. Okay, I have just told you this is a best fit line, right? Which already seems to imply that you can't do better than this. But that's only if we think in one direction, right? If we are willing to slightly open up and think of another way of posing this as a linear function approximation problem, we actually can do better. Okay, so that's what's happening with this second function. We had two. Okay, so here's what's going on. I'm going to cut up X, okay, into three portions. Okay, so specifically, I'm going to define three binary features. Binary meaning these features will have values 0 and 1. And I'm going to say B1, the first of these binary features, is going to be 1 when X is between 0 and 1. B2 is going to be 1 when X is between 1 and 2, and B3 is going to be 1 when X is between 2 and 3. And whatever, if outside of its corresponding range, any of these binary features is 0. Okay, and I'm going to say my value function estimate, we had 2, is W1 times B1 plus W2 times B2 plus W3 times B3. Okay, where W1, W2, W3 are some corresponding weights. Okay, this is not the same W1 as what B1 hat was using, but yeah. So you can see what's going on, right? So V hat 2 is like a piecewise constant approximation of B pi. Okay, it's using three pieces. So W1 is going to be the height of the function in the region corresponding to B1, W2 for B2, and W3 for B3. Okay, and you can see at least visually with this, right? We are actually fitting the function better than the first V1 hat, right? And yeah, you can see that by saying like the sort of distance between the curve and the blue line, right, in general is smaller than the distance between the curve and the red line in most places. Okay, is this a linear function approximation? It is. Okay, so it is not linear in the original x, right? Clearly v2 is not of the form wx w1x plus w2, but it is linear in b1 b2 and b3, as this formula here shows us. Of course, b1 b2 b3 are themselves not linear in x. Okay, so that's the trick. We have come up with derived features b1 b2 and b3, so they all are derived from x. Maybe we used our domain knowledge, maybe we have used some additional information to come up with these new features, but then we have something that is linear in our new features, okay, which is doing a better job than our original function. Can we use it? Why not, right? We have the liberty to design our own function approximation scheme. So we design b1, b2, b3, which are non-linear in the original x. Right? That's because they're sort of cutting up x based on if then else rules, and we're defining something that's linear in b1 and b2, b3. Okay, so good. So we can do better job if we are allowed to define new features in this manner. Can we actually do better than v hat 2? So the most natural way to extend from v hat 2 to v hat 3 here is just increase the number of piecewise constants. Okay, v hat 2 was just using three, cutting up into three regions, but now each of those regions I have cut up into I think 6 regions, right? So there's a total of 18 small piecewise constants that I have drawn here in green color, and I'm calling that v hat 3. Okay, instead of 3 binary features, it has 18 binary features. Each of them has a corresponding weight, and so you can see you can get an even better fit. Okay, so the green line is much closer to the actual curve than the blue line. It's understandable, right? So the question now we have to ask is, if we look at these three approximations, all of them are linear in their input features. The input features themselves are not maybe the original feature. For v hat 2 and 3, they are derived binary features. So is v hat 3, right, which is clearly achieving the best fit, our best choice for linear function approximation, right? So you have to be a little bit careful in answering this question, because yeah, clearly it can sort of give us the lowest error, but it might not be that desirable from some points of view. Okay, so the way to say it is v hat 3 has the highest resolution. Okay, so I'm not formally defining resolution, but the basic idea is, imagine 2 points. You want to try to make them as close together as possible while still being able to assign arbitrary function values to these 2 points. Okay, so let's say there are these 2 points A and B that are fairly close together. Does our function approximation scheme allow us to give some value for A and another value for B, and you can arbitrarily set A and B? So at least in the context of what we're doing right now, right, let's take this as an indication of resolution. The closer you're able to do this, your ability to do this for a closer set of points means you have higher resolution. If you can't, then you have lower resolution. So notice from this figure that like the blue curve, right, v hat 2 is sort of constrained to give the same value to both A and B, right? Both of them fall inside of this B2 region. So you really don't have the facility, the power to give different function values for these, but you can with v hat 3. In fact, that's happening over here. they each have a separate binary feature, right? And you can have a different weight for them and therefore give them different function values. So V-hat3 has higher resolution in this sense. That's also maybe a weakness of V-hat3, okay? In the sense that imagine you're actually doing reinforcement learning, you're doing, let's say, TD lambda, TD0 with this linear function approximation scheme, right? V-hat3. Now, suppose you encounter a state which has got feature value A. You go and do a learning update for that state. So what's going to happen? So what's going to happen is only the coefficient for A is going to get changed. The coefficient for B, which is quite close to A, at least visually, is not going to be touched. Okay. So in this sense, V-hat3 does not generalize enough. When you're making an update for a state, the range in the proximity of that state, which is also getting affected, is small, right? Because the width of this interval is small. Is that good or bad? So in general, you would like to generalize. See, we're in a scheme where you can have a very large number of states, right? You might only have a finite amount of data, or the amount of time you have for gathering data might be limited, and with what little you have, right, you must try and learn something meaningful, even for states that you've not visited, right? Clearly, that will happen with V-hat2 better here than it's happening with V-hat3, right? Because you make an update for A, it's using the same weight as the one for B, right? So V-hat2 will generalize and V-hat3 will not, and this does make a difference in practice. Okay, so V-hat3 is not the obvious choice. Of course, yeah, you could say that. I mean, it's better. Probably both of these are better than V-hat1, which is very limited in its representation. It's constrained to learn like a single line for the entire range, right? So V1-hat doesn't really have enough sort of expressive power, but the other two do. But amongst V-hat2 and V-hat3, we have to try and get both resolution as well as generalization. Can we do that? Okay, can we have like a linear function approximation scheme that allows us to discriminate points which are fairly close together, but at the same time, when you make an update, it has like a wider region that gets affected. Does it generalize well? So the answer to that is tile coding. Okay, tile coding is a very simple, natural approach for making sure that you can have a good handle on both how much you can resolve and how much you generalize. So I'm showing it here pictorially on the same sort of x-axis. X is going from 0 to 3. There's no real y-axis on this figure. Okay, I've drawn what is called 6 tilings. I've drawn them one on top of the other just so that we can see them clearly, right? There's no real significance to the y dimension. Okay, so what's going on over here? So formally, a tiling. Okay, a tiling is a partition of X, and more specifically, it is a partition of X into regions of equal width. Okay, so you can see that, let's say the first tiling, right, which is the blue tiling, partitions X into these 3 tiles from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, and 2 to 3. All right. Each of these is called a tile. Okay. The blue line from 0 to 1, that's a tile. 1 to 2 is a tile. 2 to 3 is a tile. So tiling has multiple tiles. Usually the tiles are all of equal width. And in tile coding, the approach is usually to have multiple tilings. Okay, that's why this picture has 6 tilings. So let's say there are m tilings in general. The idea is that every tiling is going to be slightly offset from the previous tiling. Okay, so because I'm using 6 tilings here, the second tiling, right, the red tiling is, it's got its boundaries 1/6 the tile width away from the first tiling. And the pinkish, whatever color that is tiling, is 1/6 away from the red tiling in terms of where it starts. Okay, and because it's starting and it's all equally spaced, the same sort of offset, right, is maintained as you go along. And yeah, the idea is we should try and cover up the space we were given, which is 0 to 3. And so some of these tilings, you will notice, have 4 tilings, right, that are overlapping with this region. They might also be going out a little bit on the left side and right side. That's totally okay, right? But then if you have 6 tilings, each sort of 1/6 away from the previous one, By the time you get to the seventh tiling, right, if you do the same thing, then the seventh tiling is going to look identical to the first tiling, right? So that's usually what happens. Now, each tile, okay, so each of these small line segments has an associated weight. Okay, so each tile can be thought of as it's basically a binary feature, and it has an associated weight. And the function value that you are going to calculate for a point, remember that's the whole point of doing tile coding of function approximation. You're going to be given a point. So if you're given some point, you want to be able to come up with an approximation of the value function, let us say. So you need a function value that is calculated for that point, right? So the simple approach here is that for each point, you see which tiles are being activated by this point, which means which are the features, binary features that are set to 1 for this particular point, and you sum up their weights. Okay, so if you want to look at this visually, this is the point we're looking at. It's going to have exactly one tile that is set to 1 in each of these 6 tilings. Okay, there are 6 tilings, but each tiling is a partition, right? So each tiling will have exactly one tile that is passing through this point, one and only one, right? And that it will have a corresponding weight, right? So if somebody asks you what is the value you are predicting for this point, right, this vertical line, you look at the weight corresponding to this blue tile, this red tile, this pink tile, this green tile, etc. You'll have 6 weights, add them up, and say that's the value that I'm computing. Okay, that's the idea under tile coding. So again, each tile here is a binary feature. So when we drew this line and drew these tiles, these are the tiles that turn out to be 1 for this particular x value. Everything else is 0, right? That's the reason we are not drawing it. But now you can see that these two parameters, right, the tile width as well as the total number of tilings, these two in conjunction determine how well you generalize and how much you can resolve. Okay, so in particular, so you can already see this visually. If you have like a larger tile width, it's going to mean that when you make an update for this particular point, there's a big region, right from the left of this pink tile to the right of this red tile. That whole region is going to have its value changed by some amount or the other. Okay, some of them share one tile, some of them will share multiple tiles, whatever, right? But there is some sort of region of influence that is governed by the tile width as well as the number of tilings, and you can also still resolve. Okay, so any 2 points. So suppose I just give you 2 points which are more than offset apart. Okay, offset, remember, is like 1/6 of the tile width in this example. You can certainly give them arbitrary function values, right? So you just need 2 tiles actually to do this. So you can pick 2 tiles which are not overlapping for these 2 points. Okay, and give them those values, give everything else like a 0 weight. You'll be able to resolve them. Okay, you might not be able to resolve too many points because there is of course some dependency, because you'll have shared tiles if you're looking at 3, 4, 5 points, and you might not be able to set each of them arbitrarily, but you get the picture. Okay, with 2 points which are more than offset apart, you can give them arbitrary function values, and that's like a useful feature to have if you want to be able to represent difficult looking functions. You can go some way in that direction by using this expressive power that you have. Okay, so that's tile coding. How does this correspond with what we do in reinforcement learning? So the usual thing we're trying to do is prediction or control. So let's just do this with the example of control. So it's very common that you will want to approximate Q. Okay, you can use tile coding for doing that. So for every feature value x, right, let us say that it has a corresponding set of tilings. Okay, like the picture you saw on the previous slide had 6 tilings. So for each feature x, let's say there are 6 tilings, right, or some number of tilings which is fixed beforehand. That has to compute a function. Okay, and the function that it computes, as we saw, was the sum of the weights of the tiles that are activated by this feature x. Okay, now how do we go from here to actually approximating Q of SA? That's what we want to do, right? You're given a state and an action, and you are asked what is the function value for this. So there are multiple ways of doing it. Maybe the most common, okay, and somewhat simple way of doing it is to say that I'm going to have a separate set of tile codings, okay, like the picture you saw on the previous slide. I'm going to have a similar picture for each action and state feature. Okay, so I'm not going to have any tiles that I'm going to use. I won't be using the same tiles for action 1 and action 2. Action 1 has a very different set of tiles from action 2. And even for action 1, the tiles I'm going to use for a particular feature, maybe there are 3 features, right? Each of them will have its own set of tiles, which means each of them will have its own binary features and weights not shared with the other features. Okay, that's common. You'll see very shortly that you don't need to actually be doing it in this way. I'm just putting it up as a sort of first cut placeholder and something that is done quite commonly. Okay, so for each action A and state feature J, okay, let's say there are D state features, you will have a set of tile codings T, A, J. Okay, and so when you're asked what is your estimate for Q of SA, you only look at the tiles corresponding to this action A, and for each action A, go over each of your features. Okay, look at it one feature at a time, and for your first feature, what is the corresponding tile coding scheme giving to you as your function value, right? It's going to give you Taj of xj of s for feature j. Add this up over all the features. Okay, do it for the first feature, sum it up with the second feature, sum it up with the third feature, etc. So in fact, maybe now is not a bad time to do a small calculation. So if each of these TAJs, right, let us say had M tilings, okay, M being like the number of tilings, 1 over M tile width, remember, was the offset. Then when you're looking at a particular action, how is your binary feature vector going to look, right? The one that is induced from using this tile coding scheme. You're going to have M active tiles for each of the features, okay, and there are D such features, so you will have M times D 1 features, and everything else will be a 0 feature. Okay, all right, and you can see that I mean, this gives us a lot of flexibility. If you're doing it like this, then you can actually use different tile widths for different features. Okay, that's usually a very useful thing to do because I mean, this comes from actually what the features are, right? So for example, when I've done this with soccer, you will have features of state. Some of them are distances, some of them are angles. So you have some intuition about how much you should generalize based on distance, right? So you might use, let's say, a tile width of 2 meters. Okay, if you're tiling a distance feature, or maybe 5 meters, it doesn't matter. Okay, this number should also somewhat correspond with the number of tiles that you use. And if it's an angle, right, 2 meters does not make any sense, right? If you're measuring angles in degrees, then maybe 10 degrees is a reasonable tile width. Okay, if something is happening and you're making an update, then states which are within 10 degrees, right, of this particular feature will also get updated to some extent, let us say. Okay, and yeah, if you so want, you can also change the number of tilings used for different states, different state features, actions. So that's not commonly done, but you could do it if you wanted. Okay, yeah. So now I also wanted to tell you that you're not necessarily constrained to have like a separate tiling for each feature. If you think it's a good idea to learn something that conjoins 2 features. Okay, so there might be 2 features that you might want to discriminate in conjunction. So you can use what's called a 2-dimensional tile coding scheme. So if you have features x1 and x2, I'm just pictorially here drawing 3 tilings, red color, blue color, and green color. I've also not sort of drawn this from to sort of extend over the entire range, just so that visually we can see what's going on. But you can have a tile, right, that has a certain width in the x1 axis as well as the x2 axis. Okay, and this tile will get, let's say, this middle red tile will get activated if x1 falls in this range and x2 falls in this range. Okay, and everything else will be 0. But still, we have the same property that you take any x1 comma x2 over here now, it will have exactly one tile from each of the underlying tilings, and then you can sort of do the same thing. Okay, so it's the case that I mean, when you have like multi-dimensional tilings like this, right? You have 2-dimensional or even 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional tilings. You can actually represent more complex functions. Okay, if we were trying to do this with 1-dimensional tiling, what would we have done? We would have like a separate way to cut up the x1 as well as separate way to cut up the x2. So if we actually did this with the same tile widths, right, you'll have, let's say, 3 tiles for x1 and 3 tiles for x2, which are not really acting in a sort of conjunctive way. So you have like 6 weights that you can set, let's say if you're just using the red tiling, right? But you can see that you have 9 right now, okay, with a 2-dimensional tiling. So in general, when you go to higher dimensions, the number of tiles that you get, right, with a multi-dimensional tiling, that goes up exponentially, right? Whereas if you have multiple 1-dimensional tilings, the number of tiles only goes up polynomially, okay? And so exponential is better if you want to resolve more. However, we do have issues, right? It's going to take up more memory. You might actually not need that many tiles. You might actually benefit by generalizing more along entire axes. So again, many of these are design questions. There's no sort of obvious answer to which is the right way of doing it. So let's just review tile coding, which we've seen in the first part of the lecture. So the big message to get across to you is linear is not bad. Okay, so the fact that we're using linear function approximation does not mean we are forced to learn very simple sort of impoverished functions. It really depends on what are the input features to the function approximation scheme. Okay, and we can discretize cut up if we want the raw input feature that we are given to us and do something linear on that. Okay, in fact, the way we are doing it with tile coding, with each binary feature, we make it actually a binary feature, right? And we have like a single weight, but you don't need to learn sort of horizontal lines for each region of the feature. You can learn piecewise linear instead of piecewise constant if you so want. It's usually not done. Okay, piecewise constant or tile coding is common because it works well. It's simple, and tile coding is the sort of standard way of doing this. The big facility it gives us is to control both the amount of generalization as well as how well you can resolve input points, especially in tandem with Sarsa Lambda. Okay, we saw Sarsa last week or maybe 2 weeks back. Sarsa Lambda is, I mean, you'll have to use it with function approximation in practice, right? So linear function approximation is a very common choice, and tile coding as the linear function approximator is perhaps the most common choice. Okay, it just works very well on a large number of control tasks, many practical successes. In fact, last time I showed you half-field offense, right? And that uses linear Sarsa 0 with tile coding. And yeah, we're not getting so much into the implementation aspects. So it's actually the norm usually that when you're using tile coding, you don't worry about the range of different features. Okay, I showed you x going from 0 to 3. It doesn't matter. You don't need to know actually what the range is because you can actually implement infinite tilings. Okay, that in principle can actually look at points from minus infinity to infinity. The way that this works is you don't really have a dedicated tile a weight value for each value of the feature, but you use hashing. Okay, so when you look at a particular point, so in your mind you can compute what would be the region of the space, what is the weight that should be, what is the feature that should be corresponding to this. But then because you put your weights in a hash table, right, you can have multiple features sort of colliding and using the same space. Okay, so if you use hashing, so at least in principle, what can happen is there might be multiple tiles, in principle different tiles that use the same weight for being as their weight, right? So which is in principle a slight violation of how we defined it. The thing is, in practice, it really doesn't seem to matter that much. Okay, a little amount of collision in the weights does not seem to hurt in many of these applications. In fact, it is the most common implementation of tile coding. And again, one-dimensional tile coding are maybe the most commonly used. I've seen two dimensions in some places. One of my students last semester used three-dimensional tilings, which he found to be working better than one and two for a particular application. But it's not very common, okay? Because normally you will have a large number of features and a fair amount of collision when you have three-dimensional, four-dimensional tilings. Okay, all right. So that was tile coding. You can also you should in fact read up Sutton and Bartow, which has a very nice illustration of the entire thing. Okay, and it's used quite commonly in practice. So yeah, that's why we took a closer look at this very specific form of function approximation. Okay, so what's coming up next is things that are not so good with function approximation, even with linear function approximation. So let's look at what is going on. So although our aim here is to show that there are issues with especially control, okay, when you're using function approximation, there is this nice example to show that same effect even with the simpler problem of prediction. So let's go through this. Okay, so this is called a counter example, and this is due to Tsitsiklis and Van Roy. So this is a simple episodic task. It's in fact like a Markov chain, right? There's only like one policy. Let us say there's not multiple actions. So you have non-terminal states S1 and S2. S1 goes deterministically to S2 and gives you a reward of 0. S2 with probability epsilon terminates. With probability 1 minus epsilon stays put in S2. Again, rewards are 0. Okay. So I mean, it's quite easy to see that the value for each of these states is 0, right? You only get 0 rewards all the time. Your value is 0. And let's assume that the start state for these episodes is S1. Okay, you'll start at S1 and then go to S2 and either stay in S2 for some time. In fact, stay in S2 for some time, right? That time being random, and then you'll go to the terminal state. So suppose we are going to try and predict these values using linear function approximation, and particularly with a form of linear function approximation that uses only a single weight W. Okay, so we are saying that we are going to try and find W so that the value prediction for the first state S1 is W itself. So it's as though S1 has a feature value that is 1, and that gets multiplied by this weight W, and x of S2, it's as though it has a feature value of 2, right? And that also gets multiplied by W. This W is sort of forced to be the same, right, for both of these states. And yeah, so V hat of S1 is W, V hat of S2 is 2W. Okay, that's what we are constraining ourselves to do. Now, what is the optimal W, right? What is the W that gives us like the best prediction? If we know that the value function is actually 0, right? And the predictions are W and 2W. I mean, it's quite easy to see that the optimal setting is W equal to 0, right? If you set W equal to 0, then you get 0 prediction error. It's the exact answer, okay? So it's really as simple as it can be from a sort of conceptual standpoint. You can get to the exact answer. I mean, you know the exact answer. The question really is, can you get to the exact answer? Okay, so that's where we'll notice that there's a bit of a hiccup. Okay, and this was demonstrated 24 years back by Tsitsiklis and Van Roy. It's from their paper. So what we're going to do is design a natural looking iteration scheme for W. Okay, we'll assume we'll start with some arbitrary W and keep refining it using, I mean, a very sort of natural looking scheme that uses bootstrapping. So we'll go from W0 to W1 to W2. The question is, will we eventually get to W equal to 0, right, by doing this, because we know that's the answer. In fact, it has no prediction error. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at next. So we know, by the way, last time we did convergence with linear function approximation for TD, right? And there we actually showed that with TD1 you will go to the W star that minimizes the error, and for TD lambda you'll go to some region of that. That is still true, right? The difference here is that the update rule is not exactly TD0 or TD lambda. It's something else that looks fairly similar, right, and intuitive, but it is different from them, and hence the question remains. Okay, it is still an unanswered question whether we will converge to 0. Okay, so here is the thinking, and this is how we are going to come up with our update rule. So from any state S, let S prime and R determine the random variables that are the next state and the reward. Okay, so here is our idea. Okay, if our current estimate is V hat, okay, so V hat, remember, is parameterized by a single parameter W, then the idea of bootstrapping is to use like a one-step look ahead, right, to compute like a better estimate of the value, right? So for each state, if v hat of S is the current estimate, then we should expect, right? This is the idea behind bootstrapping, that the expected value of R plus gamma times V hat of S prime is a better estimate. Okay, so what we were doing with TD is to actually only use like a sample drawn from this. We were actually going along a trajectory, right, and then doing an update based on R plus V hat S prime for the random variables R and S prime. But now, in fact, we are going to do something that's even more convenient. We are actually going to slightly do like a planning type thing where we calculate this expectation and put it back in, okay, because we have access to this MDP. But you should expect the same thing to happen if we also did like a sample update. Okay, it's more direct to see when you have like a full expectation calculated. And here's what we're going to do. Okay, so we have a current WK, let us say. The question is, what should we set WK plus 1 to be? Okay, so here is the idea over here. Let us find the W that is a best fit for the bootstrapped estimate over both these states. Okay, we have state 1 and state 2. Each one has a current estimate, which will be WK and 2WK. Each one will also have a bootstrapped estimate, right? Because you can calculate this expected value of R plus gamma times V hat of S prime for each of these states. And the update rule that we are proposing is, let us set WK plus 1 to be that W that minimizes this square difference. Okay, so this is the bootstrapped estimate, this is the current estimate. Let's square it, okay, and sum it up over both of our states and set our WK plus 1 to be that W that minimizes this squared error. Okay, seems like a reasonable thing to do. Okay, so it's not like a simple order 1 type of update. Well, I don't know if it's order 1 or not, but it's not like a sampling update. Okay, so we're calculating these expectations and solving like a small optimization problem to find the W that minimizes the gap between current estimate and your current bootstrapped estimate, and you setting that to be WK plus 1. And you can start with some arbitrary W naught and then do this kind of an iteration. And so the question is, if you do this, right, are we guaranteed to get WK limit, right, as k goes to infinity? Will that converge to 0, which we know is the correct answer over here? And yeah, I mean, 0 is not only the correct answer, it's the only correct answer, right? Anything that's non-zero will have some prediction error, but 0 does not. So let's see. Okay, we're going to actually translate this into the actual numbers coming from this Markov chain and see whether our iteration is guaranteed convergence to 0. Okay, so let's actually fill out what these values are. So WK plus 1 is supposed to be the W that minimizes this quantity over here. So this quantity over here is a sum of 2 terms, right? For state 1 and then for state 2. So for state 1, the current value estimate we had of Wx of S is W itself, okay? And the expectation of R plus gamma times V hat, what's that going to be? So you're sort of deterministically going to go from S1 to S2, right? So you'll have a reward of 0 plus gamma times your current estimate for S2 is 2 times WK. Okay, so 2WK minus W, that's the error squared coming from the first state. similarly for the second state, your current estimate is 2 times W, and this bootstrapping estimate is what's going to happen here. With probability epsilon, you'll get 0. Okay, so you don't have to write that down. But with probability 1 minus epsilon, you're going to stay in the same state, and your estimate starting from there is going to be 2 gamma WK, right? So this is the term coming from the second state. You square these two things and sum them up, and we want to find the W, right, that minimizes this. So this is a quadratic function. You can minimize it by completing the square or doing like a small differentiation, and you'll figure out that the answer comes out to be that the W that minimizes this is gamma times 6 minus 4 epsilon divided by 5 times WK. Okay, I mean that's like exact. It's the W that minimizes this quantity. So the iteration that we are therefore coming up with is WK plus 1 is something times WK, and that something is gamma times 6 minus 4 epsilon divided by 5. So now we have to ask the question, will this iteration take us from any WK to, from any W0 to 0? It's not very hard to see that it need not. Okay, so imagine, let's just start with, let's say W naught equal to 1, and take like a small epsilon, take epsilon equal to 0.1, let us say. Right? If epsilon is 0.1, the numerator here is going to be 5.6, right? 6 minus 0.4. 5.6 divided by 5 is 1.1 something. If you multiply that by a gamma, that's also large, right? Let's say 0.99. You're going to get a quantity here that's greater than 1. Okay, so WK plus 1 is going to be greater than some, let's say 1.1 or 1.01, whatever, right? Some number greater than 1 times WK. And basically means that W is going to grow, right? It's going to go all the way to infinity as you take K to infinity. It's not going to get smaller. Of course, it might get smaller if it contracts rather than expands, but we've seen legitimate values of gamma, epsilon, and W naught, right? Such that there's an expansion that will go all the way to infinity. And it will go to minus infinity if you start with a W naught that's less than 0. Okay, so there's divergence, and it's not what we were expecting, right? It's a simple enough problem. There's like a correct answer that's so obvious to see, and yet a fairly natural looking update scheme that's not even using samples, that using the exact expectation is diverging, right? It's not giving us the right answer. So why is this happening? So although this is only an illustration, there are many other also studies that point to this same effect. There are 3 factors that are coming into play as a part of this iteration, okay? And it is usually the combination of all 3 of these that results in this kind of problems, okay? So what are these 3 things? The first is that we are doing what's called off-policy updating. So what does it mean over here? So off-policy updating here means the importance, right? The credit or the weight that we are giving to each state. So that is not consistent with the frequency with which the state is encountered, okay? So with TD0, for example, remember that the weighting function that we used was the stationary distribution of the policy that we were following, okay? So here we are not doing that, okay? So if you remember, we're always starting at S1, then going to S2, and then spending some time in S2, right? And then going to the terminal state. So it's not very hard to see that if you're spending like the first time step at S1, in expectation, the number of time steps you'll spend at S2 is going to be something like 1 over epsilon. Okay, so if epsilon is 0.1, for every 1 time in S1, we are spending about 10 time steps in S2, right? But look at the update that we are making over here. We are doing like an unweighted sum of squares, okay? So we're sort of giving them equal prominence, giving the states the same amount of error in some sense. So that's the meaning of off policy over here. The policy has a certain distribution, but the corresponding update, right, is not consistent with that same distribution. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is we are generalizing. Okay, we are using the same parameter to update both of these states, right? So when you make an update to the value function of one of these states, it's also going to affect the other. Okay, in this case, it's a sort of extreme form where there's only a single parameter. But even if you have multiple parameters, but they are shared, okay, among the states, that's generalization. and that can hurt you. The third aspect is bootstrapping. Okay, so what we are using as a target in this case depends on our current estimate, right? The fact that we are using R plus gamma times we had even in expectation, it depends on WK, right? And so bootstrapping along with off policy updates and generalization uh, can lead to issues. Okay, and that's what's being demonstrated over here. uh, Usually you do one of these things or two of these things, you don't run into trouble like this. Okay, sometimes you get by even doing all three of these things. So you'll see practical applications of reinforcement learning are replete with all three of these things being used, right? I mean, take big successes, take AlphaGo if you want, right? Where one part of it is doing value function approximation with neural networks. So there you're using function approximation or generalization. You are actually using bootstrapping to compute target values, and off policy is sort of a necessary evil. Okay, you need to do it when you're doing control. So if you're doing it based on sample trajectories, um, I mean, if you are predicting, right, if you have a policy whose value you're trying to estimate, I mean, sort of for free, you are going along the on policy distribution. But the whole point of control is you want to update to a better policy. Okay, so you want to learn about a new policy when you're doing control, right? That's the whole point. You want to eventually find the good policy, and you can't do that by just staying put with your current policy all the time, right? So when you are updating, you have to update for a new policy based on a distribution coming from an old policy. Now, there are technical ways of managing this sort of somehow, right, to make sure that the divergence between these distributions does not come back to bite you. But I mean, in practice, very seldom do people actually resort to such means. You just do it anyway and hope that it works. So here is an illustration, a simple illustration that it need not work. Okay, the fact that it continues to work in practice is incidental, right? Maybe we are lucky, but also to mention is, I mean, you only see the big successes that happen in practice. You don't see the failures, right? So for every one success, there might be like 100 failed example of researchers trying to solve reinforcement learning problems using function approximation. It's true. Okay, it's not surprising at all for someone who's actually been doing reinforcement learning, applied RL for many years. It shouldn't be surprising at all if you apply what you think is a very reasonable algorithm for some problem and it just doesn't work, right? It diverges or it doesn't give you the answers. It could be because something like this is happening. Okay. All right. So this is one illustration. I think it will also be useful to take a slightly bigger picture of where the issues lie. Okay. So what I've done is made a small compendium of theoretical results on function approximation. Okay. Um, so yeah, so let me begin by highlighting the asterisk over here. Um, I'm doing this based on the best of my knowledge. I think there might be some slight caveats, departures from some of the claims that I'm making over here, based on more recent literature. But by and large, right, the picture does not look very different from this. So what's going on over here? Uh, we're going to look at many of the methods that we have presented as a part of the lectures here and see, right, what are their theoretical properties under different function approximation schemes. The best you can do is actually a tabular scheme, right, where there's actually no generalization. Each state has its own entry. What happens with linear function approximation? What happens with non-linear function approximation? Things like neural networks, which are used quite often in practice. And in this direction, I'm going from prediction to control. Okay, so the first three methods, first three rows here are TD lambda, okay, TD0, TD1, and what lies in between, and then SARSA and Q learning. So here are the results. Okay, so let's maybe go, let's look at the tabular case first, and then look at linear function approximation, and then non-linear. So with tabular, right, we started all with the good news. TD0 converges. So C for converges, O for optimal. Okay, it converges to the value function. So also does TD1 Monte Carlo, and so also does TD lambda for intermediate lambda. So that's good, right? Let's begin with the good news. SARSA 0 as well as Q learning 0. Okay, so these are the versions of on policy and off policy TD control learning algorithms. with full bootstrapping. Okay, so it's like single step. You do like a one-step update at each step. They will also converge, and they also converge to optimal behavior. Okay, provided of course you do GLIE and things like that. So convergence means, I mean, you can configure the problem, the parameters, so that you can get convergence in the limit. With Sarsa lambda, okay, with lambda greater than 0, it is not known, okay, whether actually there is convergence. At least to the best of my knowledge, it's not known. Maybe it's been done. If somebody finds out that there is a proof that Sarsa lambda also converges and converges to the optimal policy, do let me know. Okay. Um, yeah. So even with the tabular case, right, there is some uncertain ground when you're doing like an intermediate amount of bootstrapping, right, or you're using the Monte Carlo returns. The difference between this and this is control. Okay, you're changing your policy as you go along, and that's the technical difficulty. All right. So the fact that it's not known also means here that there is no proof of divergence either. Okay, it's not been shown that Sarsa lambda or Sarsa 1 can diverge. So it's really something that we don't know. Almost always in practice it will converge. Okay, but convergence is not a practical thing, right? It's actually like a theoretical concept. So there we don't have like a formal proof that it is going to converge. So now let's look at the linear function approximation column. We also saw this in class last time, that TD lambda in general will converge. TD1 alone has the guarantee of converging also to the W star that minimizes the prediction error, mean squared value error. The others will converge to some region of within W star, right? But they might not converge to W star. But in some sense, this is good, right? You can converge the best possible value that you can using TD1, even with linear function approximation. It gets a little bit more interesting when you look at control. Okay, when you look at Sarsa, so it's been demonstrated that Sarsa with linear function approximation can exhibit what is called chattering. Okay, so chattering is a technical term that means you neither converge nor you diverge. Okay, so what will happen is you'll get to within, let us say, an epsilon region of some point. Okay, and you will stay inside of that epsilon region. Okay, you will not go out of it, in the sense your weights will not go off to infinity, but nor is this true for all epsilon, right? When you say convergence happens, it starts by saying you give me an epsilon and I'll guarantee you that beyond some point you'll stay inside of an epsilon ball, right? There is some fixed epsilon, right, that comes from the Markov decision process, that it's fixed. Okay, so there's like a finite epsilon, you'll stay inside of that. You could sort of keep going round and round and round. Okay, you could oscillate in some sense. So that has been demonstrated for Sarsa 0, right, and it can also be done for lambda greater than 0. Sarsa equal to 1, okay, is this special case where there's no bootstrapping. Okay, you're using the empirical returns completely. It's not known whether Sarsa will chatter if you do that. It's not known whether it'll converge or it'll diverge. So there's another not known over here. Q-learning, which is off policy, right, again is a big not known. Okay, we don't have a proof that Q-learning with linear function approximation will converge or diverge. So most often in practice, it does not diverge. Okay, under somewhat restrictive assumptions, right, you can, I think, show convergence, but it's not applicable to the sort of generic way in which we do Q-learning, like the way I described it on the slide last time. So that particular way of implementing Q-learning, right, I don't think has a guarantee, but yeah, you can adapt Q-learning. I don't know if it still should be called Q-learning in particular ways to sort of get convergence, but it's not the norm. Okay, it's not what people commonly use. Let's go one step further, look at non-linear function approximation. So this is again useful review for you. Remember that TD1 is a proper form of gradient descent. Okay, and therefore TD1 has the guarantee that if you're doing it, let's say with a neural network, you will converge to a local optimum. Okay, so by non-linear function approximator here, maybe just think of neural network. Okay, I'm thinking of one where you can actually implement these methods in a sort of incremental way. But the bootstrapping methods, right, TD lambda with lambda less than 1, because they bootstrap, are not a proper form of gradient descent. Okay, it's what's called semi-gradient descent. It's not very clear whether they will converge or they will not. Okay, and then you take that to control. You have no idea of being able to say anything meaningful. Okay, so SARSA Q learning, very often you'll apply them with nonlinear function approximation. What happens? You have to implement it and see. Okay, the theory doesn't really cover you very well, and this really, I hope, has brought out that there is a fairly big gap between theory and practice in reinforcement learning. Okay, because in practice we want to do control, we want to find better policies, we are constrained to use generalization. What happens? Well, in the sort of restricted settings, you can say something that is assuring. In the more general settings, which we normally are in, there isn't that much theoretical uh, theoretical justification of what we're doing. Okay, all right. So that was a quick, I think, recap of theoretical results with function approximation to tell you that there are these fissures, right, beginning to occur in our construction. What do we do about it? We can just wear a much more practical hat. Okay, so policy search, which is coming up now, is a much more pragmatic approach to reinforcement learning, where, I mean, we're sort of choosing not to invest so much in the theoretical basis. Okay, I mean, it does have some theory. In fact, next week we'll look at what's called policy gradient methods that are also rooted in some theory, but it's theory that chooses to ignore, right, the Markovian structure that has been very central in our analysis all this while. Okay, so let's look at policy search. Let's begin with this picture. So here's what's going on here. So again, let's assume that there is a single state feature X. The reality, let's say for this MDP, is that Q star looks like this. Okay, so for Q star, there are two actions. There are red and blue actions. So Q star for red, right, as a function of state, looks like this curve over here, and similarly there's a Q star for blue action. All right, so assume that what we have tried to do is to approximate the value function, right? Maybe we did Q learning, and let's say that we were using a linear representation. Well, again, I'm going back to just like a straight line instead of tile coding and all of that. But suppose that the two lines we have come up with are like mx plus c, okay? Or basically you can call it w1x plus w2, but let's just call it mx plus c over here. There is a separate line for approximating the red Q star and another one for approximating the blue Q star. So m red x plus c red is this line, m blue x plus c blue is this line, and it looks like it's doing a reasonable job of approximating